Okay, welcome back to the How To Podcast series. My name is Dave, and we are working through our Podcaster's Owner's Manual mini-series. It's a long title for a mini-series. We are looking at bite-sized chunks of the podcast process to get set up and get you started podcasting. And we're doing these in bite-sized little pieces so that we can go back in the future, make updates as things improve, things change. Updates happen, right? So we want to be able to come back and do them without one big, huge, long podcast. You can pick and choose the episodes that you need right now. And today we're going to talk about the format of your podcast. And how do we pick and what's going to work best for us. So we're going to talk about that here on the How To Podcast series. Here we go. So there are many different formats that your podcast can take. Many different ways to do this. And the best way is the way that works best for you. There you go. I think I just made that up. That is what you need to pick. You need to find what works best for you, what works best for your audience, what works best for your topic. So you're going to run through, I've got 8 categories that I have in front of me that we can kind of use as a guide. But understand that you can use these in any way that you wish. You can use several of these within one podcast to give you some variety. You don't have to stick with one. You create your own rules. You're in charge of your podcast. You do what works for you. Okay? So think of this as like a buffet. And I like going to the dessert buffet first. Buffets. Okay, anyways, so let's go through these. So these are the ones we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the format for your podcast. You can have a solo podcast, aka what I'm doing right now. You can do an interview podcast, which obviously you're going to interview somebody. You can have a conversation podcast, a narrative podcast. You could have a news podcast, an educational podcast. You can have a comedy podcast, or even a fiction podcast. So these are just 8. And again, there's more. Obviously, there's more. But this is just an idea. And like I said, you can have a podcast with any of these mixed in together. Solo, interview, conversation, narrative, news, educational, comedy, and fiction. And I'm going to give you some examples of some of the podcasts that I listen to that kind of fall into some of these categories as we kind of go through these. So you ready? I'm going to get some help today from a character on a TV show here in Canada. Eugene Levy was the star of it, and one of the stars. And it's all about a little town. And this town has an interesting name. And one of the characters, Eugene Levy's son, which is actually his son in real life, is his son on the show. And his name is David. So in that show, he's referred to quite often. I'm going to use little clips of that because my name is David. So here we go. These are going to separate each of our points here. 8 points. Ready? Here we go.
David.
Okay, so yeah. First one, solo podcast. Probably one of the easiest ways to start your podcast is a solo podcast. Now, good side is you don't have to work around anyone's schedule. You are in charge of everything, and it's just you. Bad side, it's just you, and you have to do it all. So solos can be great. I have several podcasts that are solo podcasts, and it is kind of nice to just be able to record whenever I want to, whenever I have a chance. I don't have to schedule somebody. I don't have to meet with them. I don't have to go over the topics with them. It's all on me. So if you're a disciplined person and you can create the content ahead of time, you can batch record, you can record multiple episodes at once. You can record like a whole month in a day and be done. And then do the editing later and put it into your host and you're good for the month. Go on with your life. So that's great if you don't mind bulking your episodes together and working on them that way. That works really well. So for me, I really like solo podcasts. I guess the only downside that I think we just mentioned at the beginning is that you have to do everything. So if you can share the load with somebody by having a co-host or an interview, a conversation style, that's nice, because then someone else can do like the social media, and you can take care of the website, and they can take care of the editing, and you can take care of the emails. So it's nice to kind of share that. But when you're a solo podcaster, you're going to do everything. So unless you outsource, you're going to do it all. And if you need help with outsourcing your podcast, let me know. I'd love to help you. Solo podcast. So that's one of the ones. So first off, when you're deciding on your podcast, do you want to go it alone? Might be easier at the beginning. It takes a while to get used to being comfortable on the microphone and talking to no one. But a solo episode is a really easy place to start. So if you can handle it by yourself, try it. And what I would suggest, head over to Buzzsprout, sign up for the free plan. You can create a podcast. It can go out into the world, and after a certain period of time, it just disappears. Great way to practice. Get an article, get something off the web, read it, record yourself, do some editing, put an intro, put an outro on there, put it out in the world, and then go listen to it in your car. Go listen to it with your earbuds in. Share it with somebody that you trust and ask for some feedback. And practice. Your first episode doesn't have to be your first episode. Just remember that. You could have 20 episodes recorded, practiced, deleted, and then record your first episode. It'd give you a lot more confidence than thinking you have to be perfect on day one. And this whole thing about your first episode's going to be terrible, it doesn't have to be. With the amount of knowledge, the amount of podcasts about podcasts, the amount of support out there for you, the idea that you can practice before you record your first episode, your first episode doesn't have to be terrible. Really. Put some time and effort into it. Solo podcast might be a great place to start.
David?
Next would be an interview podcast. So I have Living the Next Chapter, a podcast for authors. And in 11 months, we had 127 podcast episodes, most of those with guests from around the world. And you quickly get to learn how to use software for recording, whether some of them were done in the early days of Zoom. And then I switched over and do most of my recordings now in Riverside.fm. Riverside is great. It gives you really good quality recordings on your host side and your guest side. It's recording in the background and uploading as we do the episode. One thing I would suggest is you let your guests know before you hit record, at the beginning, when you first get on together, that at the end of the podcast, you will say goodbye to your audience as if the podcast is ending, but for your guests to stay on with you. Good tip. Have them stay on with you after you say goodbye, and just double check your uploads, and you'll see across the top of the screen there'll be a little upload notification, and you want to make sure that their side has been uploaded and your side is uploaded. A little thing will pop up and tell you that the files are being complete and uploaded. So make sure you check that. And because I've had guests jump off at the very end thinking we were done, and I had to kind of circle back with them and get them to finish their upload on their end. Not a huge deal, but it's kind of nice just to do that. And you get to talk to them at the end before you say goodbye. A little side tip for you. An interview is great. You can increase your reach. You can bring new people into your podcast. It's great because you actually are talking to a potential listener as well, because you get to talk about your podcast. And I always encourage my guests to go listen to an episode to kind of get a sense of how I do my podcast. And in doing that, I'm actually inviting someone to come check out my podcast. See what I'm doing there? So I'm actually talking to somebody who will be a listener, at least to one episode and their episode. So it kind of works. So go ahead and do that. Interviews are great. We have a whole section on that here on the podcast. But it's the second format for your podcast is try interviews. You'll learn a lot about others. The focus isn't really on you. The focus is on your guest. And again, we'll get deeper into interview podcasts in the future. You're on the How to Podcast series. So that was number 2. Solo, number 1. Number 2 was interview. Coming up with number 3.
David?
So number 3, as far as a format for your podcast, can be a conversation-based. It's typically hosted by 2 or more people. It involves some pretty more casual conversation on a variety of topics. So this can just be 2 people hanging out. So what I do for the How to Podcast series, which you're listening to, is I don't do interviews. I do co-hosted podcast episodes where I bring another podcaster on. And if you're a podcaster or thinking of being a podcaster, open invitation. Come on. Let's talk. But I bring co-hosted guests on and we just talk podcasting. And they get to promote their podcast. We get to talk about all that stuff. But it's a conversation. It's not an interview. It's different. Co-hosting. It's kind of like 2 people on equal playing fields having a conversation, and you include your audience. Make sure you include your audience. So I always tell everybody, let's refer to our audience. Let's refer to our listener as we're having our conversation. Let's not ignore them. Let's keep them a part of the conversation. So that was number 3. Number 4.
Ew, no, David.
Number 4 is like a little different. It's a narrative podcast. So this could be a story being told in podcast format. It presents information in a narrative format, often with sound effects, music to enhance a listening experience. For me here at True Media Solutions, we did a Daily Santa podcast in 2022. It was 25 episodes in a row, counting down to Christmas. And each episode was about 12 to 20 minutes long. Took 4 to 5 hours each day to create. It was a lot of work. It was 25 episodes in a row. And you couldn't miss a day because people were counting on the next day's episode. It had sound effects, multiple voices. I used computer-generated voices. I used sound effects. And I built a whole world around being a better human and staying on the nice list. So it was more of a narrative podcast. So it had all kinds of cool elements. Love for you to go check it out. You can go to truemediasolutions.ca. You can find us there, or you can go to dailysantapodcast.com and you can find the podcast there. Even though it's not Christmas right now, go check it out and see what you think. There's a lot of cool voices in there. So it's pretty fun. So that's a narrative podcast.
David?
Number 5 would be more of a news podcast, an information podcast. It provides updates and analysis on current events or issues or reviews of products, that kind of thing. It's a news updated podcast. The one thing about a news podcast to consider, if you're thinking about going this way, is that the content might not be evergreen. In that, if you're talking about something that is time sensitive, 5 years from now, your topic might not be something that people are looking for or would click on play in the future. So you need to make a decision at the beginning. Is evergreen content your focus? Meaning content that somebody 10 years from now can hit play on your episode and get value from your podcast? That's something that a news podcast may or may not be quite as evergreen. So just kind of think about that. Is that important to you? If it's not, that's not a big deal. That's fine. But a news podcast is generally, in general terms, something that is recent, up to date, and something that somebody's going to listen to, and then a week, 2 weeks from now, probably not going to see that listener come back. Or you're not going to see new listeners go back and binge through all of your past episodes because the topic might be out of date. So, news podcast. That's number 5. Number 6.
David?
6 is educational-based podcasting, which is kind of this as well. So this podcast is a combination of solo, educational, and conversational. So far, right? We have 3 already in one podcast. So, like I said, it can be a mixture of what you want to do. Educational podcasts aim to teach listeners about a particular subject or give them tools or expertise to do something. And these can be really niche podcasts, or as our American friends would say, niche podcasts that really get down into a topic and help you learn something new. You can have a podcast about how to fix your car, or plant a garden, knit, dirt bike, or create a podcast. Educational podcasts are great because they take people along, and you can do a short run podcast. So if it takes 10 episodes to teach somebody how to do something, create 10 episodes and you're done. It doesn't mean you have to keep going. Your podcast can be done at 10 episodes. For example, 5 episodes, 1 episode. If you're teaching somebody how to do something, you don't have to extend it forever. You can go through your topic, explain it well, and be done. So, educational podcast.
David?
Number 7 would be a comedy podcast. So one of the ones I like, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes, it's a Canadian podcast, but they have two comedians come on, and they call it the Debaters, and they debate a topic for the show. Usually do 2 debates per show. It's hosted on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, here in Canada. And I love it because these guys are hilarious. So they get on, they talk about like popcorn or, I don't know, whatever. They have a topic and they just got to debate them. And it's hilarious to hear these two. And they go back and forth with each other. And it's really, really fun. So comedy podcast. Again, every podcast doesn't have to be serious. Every podcast doesn't have to teach you something. Every podcast doesn't have to sell you anything. Sometimes, and I hear people say all the time, who is your audience and what problem do you solve with your podcast? For a comedy podcast, you just might be somebody's light in their day. When they're having a bad day, they can click play on your podcast and have a great laugh and reset. So a comedy podcast can be very helpful. Love to see more comedy podcasts out there. If you have a comedy podcast, go to howtopodcast.ca, click the little microphone icon on the website. Tell me about it. Give yourself a plug and we'll put it here in the podcast and send people your way for a good laugh. Comedy podcast, number 7. It's a good thing to do.
Ew, David.
The last podcast type that I have here on my list is fiction. Fiction podcast is a work of fictional storytelling, often in the form of like a serialized story. That's a great example of having a season. So when your story requires your listener to listen in order, so you don't want them to listen to the episode that came out today. If they're starting, they have to go back to the beginning. You can use a series setting in your host for your podcast, which will place the podcast in order of episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. And if there's multiple seasons, so if there's like a television show, you could have season 1, episode 1, season 1, episode 2. And then you can jump to season 2, episode 1. So if there's a format where you have to follow to maintain the story, has to be listened to in a certain order, that's where series comes into place. People use series a lot for breaks in their podcast schedule so that they could take the summer off to go travel. Yes, I guess you could technically you could do that. But a series is more designed around having your listener listen in order, in a specific order that you want them to listen to. I did that for the Daily Santa podcast. I put them in order so that day one was day one. So keep that in mind. So we talked through these. We have 8 different types, formats for your podcast here on the How to Podcast series. Solo, interview, conversation, narrative, news, educational, comedy, and lastly, fiction. So these are just a few examples of the many, many types, formats that exist out there in the world of podcasting. The best format for your podcast will depend on your goals and the type of content you want to produce. Keep it in mind, you are in charge. Do what you want. Try it. Practice. Ask your audience. Ask your listener, hey, are you enjoying this? Get some feedback. They are out there. And if you have a question, you want me to listen to your podcast, you want to bounce some questions off of me, I would love to talk to you. Head over to howtopodcast.ca. And like I said, there's a little microphone button. You can click on that, leave me a voice message, 90 seconds long. Or you can send me an email. Or you can set up time in my calendar. And we can sit and chat over Zoom, have a coffee together virtually, and go through some of your questions together. No pressure. Love to help. Love to be there for you and give you some tools and tips to help you in your podcast journey. Thanks for being part of the How to Podcast series. We'll talk soon. Cheers.